Here we are. Yes. Hello. Today is Monday, March the 4th. And I know we're supposed to have a test today, but we didn't quite finish what I wanted to. And so, what we're going to do today, I am coming to you after we have finished the end of that unit. You virtual students can listen to me as long as I'm on the air. In class, we tend to run longer, and then we have to shut off at a certain time. How unfortunate, right? And today after we're approaching a new chapter, the birth of modern European thought. Modern European thought, once again, bridging from the middle part of the 19th century into the 20th century. And it covers many facets that we're going to go through. And it's very important. It affects thinking, and thinking affects politics, and politics affects policy. So let us begin, shall we? Here. All right. As it says there, the birth of modern European thought. The Industrial Revolution, the second Industrial Revolution, that is, the one with steam and steel and petroleum and chemicals and electricity, left a foundation for the basis of what has become modern European thought. This trend emerged from the previous patterns. In other words, it's a natural evolution of thought. The Enlightenment had left a legacy of rationalism, toleration, cosmopolitanism, and the appreciation of science, which was followed then by Romanticism, which led the thinkers to value feelings, imagination, national identity, and the autonomy of the artistic experience. Writers began to question the value long ascribed to rationality. None of these movements were particularly sympathetic to the women's movements, but women will begin to make small inroads. For the first time in Europe, large numbers of people were snapping up the printed word and reading, both for recreation and for information. In 1850, about half of the population of Western Europe and a much higher population of Russians were illiterate. Okay. During the next half century, that number is going to improve. So, what we get out of one, Europeans are reading. They are the most educated populace on the planet. One European government after another undertook state-sponsored education programs. In other words, schools that were paid for by government expense, not by churches and not by the individual's families. Hungary in 1868, Britain 1870, Switzerland 1874, Italy 1870, etc., etc., etc. The attack on illiteracy was most successful in Britain, France, Belgium, the Netherlands, Germany, Scandinavia, Western and Northern Europe. Where, look at this stat. You have to remember stats? No, you have to remember trends. Where approximately 85% of the population could read by the year 1900. In Italy, Spain, Russia, and Austria-Hungary and the Balkans, literacy rates lagged between 30 and 60%. So as you see there, in Southern and Eastern Europe, much higher illiteracy rates. Northern and Western Europe, higher literacy. More people could read. New reading rates brought on and reflected the coming social change. Educated voters made more responsible decisions at the ballot box. Educated workers could be taught new skills and made for a more valuable workforce. School teaching grew in respect and in numbers as a respected vocation for women. Major nations also had to consider instituting secondary education. And then after that, they began to, within one generation, and now we're into the 20th century, also began to consider instituting state-supported post-secondary institutions. In other words, countries began, after they had ponied up money to fund elementary schools, then naturally it created a demand within a few years for high schools, and eventually within a generation, into the 20th century, most of the countries of Europe began creating these state-funded, taxpayer expense universities to further educate the masses. The expanding literate population wanted more and more varied reading material for which they created a major market. Advances in the printing process greatly expanded the amount of reading material available. Cheap mass circulation newspapers such as La Petite Journal and the Daily Mail of London enjoyed wide readership. Now, of course, those newspaper magazines often fringed upon the, don't get me wrong here, the National Enquirer, rag mag type, but yeah, they also contained information. They also contained a lot of racist advertising and, other things of the era. More people with different ideas could get into print in the late 19th century than ever before in European history. Cheap newspapers circulated stories of crimes and scandals, and yes, a brisk market for porn cropped up. Newspapers with editorials on the front page became major factors in the emerging mass politics. Yeah, once again, more and more people reading means more and more people are thinking, and more people are having opinions about politics. And since more and more of them are voting, these opinions matter. In Central, the press surely was the fourth estate. In Central Europe, it was the government that censored and regulated the press. The public's taste for literature could best be described as lowbrow. In other words, they wanted things that were sensationalist, that appealed to the most base instincts, violence, sex, if they could get it. However, there was a marked change in that the public's overall knowledge base continued to increase. People became smarter. Reading made them smarter. People could achieve new heights of knowledge and economic standing because of this newfound popular literacy. Science and scientists became more legitimized and even recognized with honor across Europe with the advent of the reading public. The French philosopher and socialist Auguste Comte argued for a philosophy of human intellectual development that culminated in science. Human thought, he said, developed in three stages. The theological stage, where nature, in other words, what makes the world go round, what makes everything happen, was defined in terms of mysticism, actions of divine spirits, the gods, for example. Pardon me. Then the metaphysical stage.
Attention, please. All students who ride bus 223, your bus is here.
Then the metaphysical stage, where abstract principles science were regarded as the operative agencies of nature. And finally, the positive stage, where the explanations of nature became matters of exact description of phenomena without recourse to unobservable operative principles. Yes, it confuses me too. I'll be honest. Let me be honest here. A lot of this chapter does confuse me. Intellectual history, I know it's not the most exciting thing in the world, and yet it's necessary. We're going to go over it. Comte believed that physical science had entered the positive stage. Comte believed that the positive laws of social behavior could be discovered in the same fashion as laws of physical nature through research. Comte, yes, is regarded as the father of the field of sociology. Sociology, of course, we don't teach here. I remember my son went to UK in his freshman year. He took an elective in sociology, and he went into an auditorium, 500 students in the auditorium, and the first thing the professor stands up and says in class, "I want everybody to know there are no jobs in sociology." Wes said he dropped the course the next day. Genuine knowledge in any area must resemble scientific knowledge. British Fabian socialist Beatrice Webb spoke of a religion of science that would explain all nature without resorting to the supernatural explanations like the gods did. Okay, Charles Darwin was and is one of the most controversial thinkers with his book entitled Origin of Species. Yeah, and in fact, I don't know how many of you remember, I'm sure you don't, Remembering that little video I showed you, goodness, it's been so long ago, of the top 10 most influential people of the last 1,000 years. Charles Darwin was number 5, I think. Let's see. Gutenberg was number 1. Isaac Newton number 2. Martin Luther is number 3. Shakespeare was number 4, and I think Charles Darwin was number 5 for his ideas about the not just evolution, which it already accepted, but his idea of natural selection. So Darwin was called the Newton of biology. Darwin did not originate the concept of evolution, which had been discussed widely long before he put it in print. What he and Alfred Russel Wallace did was to create the idea called natural selection. And here's the important part, which explain how species changed over time. Once again, remember that natural selection is the idea that nature chooses some species of animals and plants to thrive, to do well, to populate, some species to simply survive in a fragile environment, and other species nature selects for extermination. Yeah. Keep that in the back of your mind somewhere, because we're going to go back then and talk about social Darwinism. Yeah. This is biological selection. Others had argued that this process occurred. Darwin, and Wallace had argued that it had occurred. Drawing on Thomas Malthus, there's our friend again, Thomas Malthus, Thanos. Darwin said that there were more species and seeds and plants born than could survive, and that the ones who did survive would improve the species. The theory of evolution did not look for an all-seeing and all-knowing explanation. He said that the world was not fixed, but in a state of constant flux and change. Darwin also wrote a book called The Descent of Man. Darwin argued that men, as well as animals, had evolved. He argued that humankind's moral nature and religious sentiments, as well as its physical nature, had developed naturalistically, largely in response to the requirements of survival. Darwin said this did not require a God to accomplish. Scientists widely accepted the concept of evolution, but they did not accept Darwin's mechanism of natural selection. In the 1920s and 1930s, Darwin's theory of natural selection was combined with the insights of modern genetics. All right. Science came to have a new significance in the field of social thought and ethics. They applied the concept of struggle for human survival to human social relationships. This is one we're going to get into, social Darwinism. Very important. The phrase survival of the fittest predated Darwin and reflected the outcome of the outlook of the classical economists. Darwin's use of the phrase, though, gave it prestige and associated it with advanced science. Robert Spencer advocated the idea that human society progressed through competition. He said that if the weak were protected too much, then the rest of humankind was the loser in creating a weakened society. I mean, keep your head in all this. I mean, keep reading and make sure and you understand what it says. This concept was applied to the idea of to resist aiding the poor and to justify the domination of the colonial people in the New World. In other words, a lot of people in England, when the Irish potato famine struck and so many starved, a lot of people said, well, that's terrible. A lot of people said, well, you know what? That's God in action. God is judging these godless Catholics. And a third group said that nature had selected the Irish as an inferior race and were selecting them for extinction. And that won't be the last time that particular statement is made about a race. It also was used as justification by the Europeans to justify the domination of the colonial peoples of the New World. And it was also used to advocate aggressive competition amongst nations. The strongest nation would survive. This also, was used to, I may as well throw it in here. What did I just do? There. It also, I may as well say it now. Yeah, okay. This came to be known as social Darwinism. Yeah. When the Nazis were building the concentration camps to kill millions of people, they said, we're just science. When Heinrich Himmler once said that it is the burden, somebody put it, the burden of greatness. It is the price of greatness to step over dead bodies, like a farmer removing the branches from a tree so that the entire tree will survive. Yeah. Thomas Henry Huxley was a great defender of Darwin, but he disagreed with the social Darwinists. He declared that the physical cosmic process of evolution was at odds with the process of human ethical development. So, what does that mean? It means that what they're talking about here in social Darwinism, such as anti Semitism and things like that, it's not ethical. It's not nice. It's not human. The struggle in nature, he said, was exactly how human beings should not act. That human beings should not kill each other. One group of human beings does not have the right to decide another group of human beings doesn't have the right to survive. That's exactly how they should not act. Scientists during this period believed that they had discovered all there was to be discovered. Yeah, that's an interesting side note. In fact, William McKinley, so Christianity and how did science, affect Christianity in the view of the church? Look what I wrote in all caps. The 19th century was one of the most difficult periods in the history of organized Christianity. Many European intellectuals left the faith of Christianity. The secular and liberal nation states attacked the political and social influence of the church. The church got whammed in the 19th century. Remember the French Revolution, for example. But not just that, all across Europe during the course of the 19th century. As it says there, intellectuals left the faith. Protestant and Catholic churches still made considerable headway at the popular level, meaning that with all this going on, still, churches were increasing in membership. But that's not going to be permanent. This intellectual attack on Christianity arose on the grounds of its historical credibility of scientific accuracy and its pronounced morality. What in the world does that mean? Well, we're about to explain what it means. Grounds of historical credibility. For example, and please do not go, Go home and say, Mom, Mr. Horton said there is no Jesus. So I'm not going to say that. But what I will say is that there is no physical evidence that a guy named Jesus Christ ever lived. And he said, what about the Bible? Well, you got to remember, the Bible was written several hundred years after Jesus walked the earth. You know, there are no records that existed at the time that documented Jesus' life, rather, Jesus' birth, life, ministry, and or death. Does that mean that he didn't exist? Didn't say that, but there's no evidence. Didn't say he didn't exist, but there's no evidence. David Frederick Strauss questioned in his Life of Jesus whether or not the Bible provided any genuine historical evidence about Jesus. Oh, what did I just say? He said the story of Jesus was a myth and had arisen from the particular social and intellectual conditions of first century Palestine. Jesus represented the needs and desires of the people who lived at and during the time and place first century Palestine. Once again, did not say there wasn't a Jesus, but this guy is saying there's no evidence. Julius Wellhausen in Germany, Ernst Renan in France, and William Robertson Smith of Great Britain contended that the Gospels were written by human authors who wrote with a mind to addressing the problems of the first century Jews in Palestine. The Bible, then, they said, was not an inspired work. Now that gets a little towards the blasphemous. I did not say that. These guys said it. So they said the Bible is not an inspired work, which is what all Christian religions contend, that the Bible is an inspired work of God. But they're saying that it's a Homeric ethic. In other words, a long story written about someone who is, very good, written by normal human beings in a primitive society. In science, even though there are many scientific thinkers said that scientific knowledge would reinforce the Christian faith, William Paley's natural theology enshrined that belief. The geology of Charles Lyell suggested that the earth was much older than the Bible had dated, which, to be honest, is what a lot of people say. Darwin's theory also cast doubt on the Genesis creation story. Other intellectuals questioned the morality of Christianity. Say that again. Other intellectuals questioned the morality of Christianity. Because I'm telling you, I grew up. One of my favorite books when I was a kid was the Bible storybook. And, I've read much of the Bible. I used to teach Sunday school. And to be honest, the Old Testament is like Game of Thrones. It should be rated R. I mean, any kind of sin or vice you want to find, you can find in the Old Testament. New Testament, not so much. And so that's what it's talking about, immoral Bible stories. For example, the first king of Israel was a guy named Saul, Saul. And normally it would follow that the second king of Israel would be the son of Saul, but that didn't happen. Why didn't it happen? Because Saul disobeyed God. What did Saul do? Now, here's where we get into the. According to the book of Samuel, 1 Samuel, I think, Samuel, the prophet of God, told Saul that he is to make war on this particular town. I don't know the town. And God will give him the victory. But in doing so, Saul was to kill every man, woman, and child in that town, village, city, whatever, and every living thing in the village. And so, battle ensues, and Saul does what he's told, kills every man, woman, and child, and then he notices this town has a lot of cows. Wouldn't it be awesome if I could keep some of the cows? I know. I'll just keep the cows, sacrifice to God a certain number of the cows, and then I keep the rest of the cows. And of course, the remnant of the story is that Samuel shows up, the prophet shows up and says, "What's all them cows doing?" And Saul says, "Oh, I just want to make some sacrifices." And because of that, Saul loses his right to have his son be the next king. In other words, because Saul didn't slaughter every living thing, he had indeed slaughtered every man, woman, child, but every living thing, then he went against the will of God. You know, that kind of story, you kind of is how moral is that? And don't go home, tell your mom, do not go home, tell your mom, Mr. Horton said that the Bible's immoral. That's what he's saying, this author here. The moral character of the Old Testament God, cruelty and unpredictability of the Old Testament God did not fit well with the progressive, tolerant, and rational values of the new liberals of the latter part of the 19th century. They, the new liberals, also wondered about the morality of God who would sacrifice for his own satisfaction, the only perfect being ever to walk the earth. Ah, yes, Frederick Nietzsche. Now, if you're looking, Mr. Arlinghouse, I'm sorry, Mr. Arlinghouse, I forgot to mention you. I forgot, I'm sorry. If you're looking for Mr. Arlinghouse for somebody I don't get, Frederick Nietzsche. Don't get him. I don't understand him. Nietzsche, yeah. Nietzsche was a thinker who portrayed Christianity as a religion of sheep and glorified weakness rather than the strength that life required. Now, this Nietzsche guy, he was all about man and Superman. That the best people, according to Nietzsche, was not the ones who listened to the edicts of Christianity, but the ones who did whatever they wanted to. As it says there, Christianity demanded a useless and debilitating sacrifice of the flesh and spirit rather than full-blooded heroic living and daring. Nietzsche said, war and courage have accomplished more great things than love thy neighbor. The upper levels of educated society created a climate in which Christianity had lost much of its intellectual respectability. More and more people found that they could live their lives without reference to Christianity. In other words, the church was losing ground in Europe. Another factor that was that cities were growing in population so quickly that cities didn't have enough churches. Yeah, if you wanted to go to church, you had to walk forever or ride if you could afford it. And so, yeah, people said, "Oh, I can't go to church, sorry." Whole generations of the urban poor grew up without exposure to the church as an instrument of the faith. All right, so the secular state of the latter half of the 19th century clashed with both Protestant and Catholic churches. Liberals generally disliked the dogma and the privilege that was enjoyed by the major churches. Nations were suspicious of the multinational nature of the Roman Catholic Church. I mean, the Roman Catholic Church, the word Catholic means universal. It's a church everywhere. And in the latter part of the 19th century, as Europe is drifting towards World War I, how can a French priest and a German priest not be enemies? How can a French priest tell his French congregation, love your German enemies, and vice versa? And so people began to be suspicious about these, international churches, particularly the Roman Catholic Church, that said, love your brother who's on the other side of the Rhine River. Previously, most education in Europe was state-sponsored. That's wrong. That's wrong. I'm sorry, Mr. Arlinghouse. I'll fix that for you. Was church-sponsored. I was up late last night, Mr. Arlinghouse. Get off me. From 1870 through the turn of the century, religious education was heatedly debated in every major country. You know what, Mr. Arlinghouse? That is a good place to end right there. Okay. We're on the numeral 9, and we're already 5 pages in. We'll go through this chapter fairly quickly. In fact, tomorrow when I'm home, Mr. Arlinghouse, I'm going to work on this test. Yeah, because so yeah, I think I'll bid you adieu. Okay? Bye, guys.